Thank you, Mark, for that. We will be concluding with the Lord's table following the teaching this morning, which will continue in the book of 1 Corinthians, because we've been working our way through Corinthians, tracking the thought week by week, which is always a good thing to do. Get into the flow of a book and what are the things that are being discussed and talked about. And so we've been learning very much from the Apostle Paul, particularly this area of sexuality, human sexuality. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 have been giving us extensive instruction and really a biblical vision for sexuality. And we find ourselves coming at the tail end of that in 1 Corinthians 7, which really we looked last week at. Paul's kind of, the first 6 chapters were focusing on Paul addressing some issues from a report. He didn't live in Corinth, of course, but he got a report back about some of the things that were going on in the church, and he sort of answered those in the first 6 chapters. In chapter 7, he was specifically addressing questions that the Corinthians had. And he's very much focused on that. And people found themselves in different situations in relationships, whether single, whether married, divorced, all sorts of situations, some who had unbelieving spouses. And so there was all sorts of questions that Paul wanted to address in regards to that. So I think we should look at this morning's topic, which is really about singleness, how to think about being single. Now, last thing I want to do is for folks who are in here now and say, wow, no, that's great. I can nod off now, Pat, for the next 40 minutes. This doesn't relate to me, and I suspect the singles are on the edge of their seats, about to fall off. Well, I want to assure you, no, it does have something to speak to you about. Did you ever think about it? Even if you're married, you're actually going to leave this world single. Unless you happen to go at the exact same time together, but that's very highly unlikely, isn't it? But think about that. It's not something we like to think about, of course. But even if you're married, you're going to leave this world single. And in many ways, you have children and grandchildren. And of course, we need to kind of know how we need to encourage singles and really... be a sense of encouragement to them. And certainly, I don't want us to be coming up with typical of what our society is, that when someone comes of age, they start getting to the early 20s, that's okay. And then start getting to the mid-20s, late 20s. And then someone's talking to them and saying, you're still single, are you? And that's not good. That's not good. In fact, you're going to get a good perspective of singleness, actually, from Paul. You're going to get tremendous encouragement as a single person. And if that's where you find yourself today, that's your situation, you're going to get great encouragement from Paul. And let's just track the thought now as we walk through these few verses here. When Paul writes, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. I want to spare you this. Now, Paul gets off the mark here. Now, the word virgins there is not necessarily addressing those who are sexually inexperienced. It's actually a much broader word. It can include those who are divorced, maybe, but mainly the idea is single, not yet married. So Paul is specifically addressing them. And he says, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. And what Paul's really saying there is that, again, Jesus didn't speak on this issue specifically. We talked about that last week when he says, not I, but the Lord. And then he says, the Lord said this, and this is what I'm saying. You see, in the Gospels, Jesus addressed the idea of marriage and divorce, but he didn't deal with this area of singleness and giving advice to singles. And Paul is saying, I'm going to give you a judgment on this. In other words, I'm going to give you my opinion. But opinion sounds a little soft. It's not a command. You can clearly say he's saying this. This is not a command, but this is somewhere in between an opinion and a command. And he's saying he has the authority to do this as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy, and he's acknowledging God's work in his life there. And he's saying, I think I can give some instruction in this area that really Jesus didn't speak about. So that's exactly what he's saying here. And then he says, because of the present crisis. And then he goes on to say, you should remain as you are. In other words, if you're married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. And but he's qualifying that then, isn't he? And he's saying, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if you were to summarize what Paul is kind of saying here, he's saying, it's okay to be single. Okay? It's okay to be single. Now, Paul included himself in that group, He saw that last week. He said, I wish you were as I am. And we know at that particular point in Paul's life, he was a single man. And singleness is a good thing. It's required in the sense that it's not wrong either way. And we talked last week about some people have a call for singleness. They know that. They're very contented. I was just talking to a lovely Christian man yesterday, and we were talking about this subject, and he said, yeah, Pat, now I'm 41. But and of course he's single, but quite content to be single. He said it with a smile on his face, in the sense that here was a guy that was just perfectly content in a single. And Paul's saying, that's good. That's great. Again, if you don't have that and you have a sense, and he'll give some instruction later on. I think what baffles many commentators here when it says, because of the present crisis. What is that crisis? What is going on in Corinth? What's happening? Now, we're really not told. Some say that maybe there was a famine that had come on the land, and maybe he was addressing specifically, look, you're better off just staying as you are. With a famine, it's hard enough to feed yourself, never mind if you had a wife and kids to feed. Some say maybe there was persecution that was just about to come. Others just think maybe it was just a present crisis, as in this day and age, or in that day and age. Life is hard. Because he goes on to talk about we'll face many troubles in this life. That with the brokenness of life and the fact that we're broken, life is difficult. Now, whether he's talking about that or, again, we're just not sure if it was something specific that was going on, or if he was just maybe even talking about the particular crisis maybe within the Corinthian church. We know there was a lot of difficulties there, and when you read that letter, you pretty much get that. But we don't really have to know what the present crisis was, but Paul is just given that lovely advice of being contented in your singleness. That you don't have to be wondering, is there something wrong with me because I'm single, or whatever you find yourself this morning. Absolutely not. And I think we're going to find out why in a minute. And then he's clearly addressing those who are married. Stay married. He already spoke about that in the previous text. And then when we go on to verses 29, we're going to find out why he's saying that. Why he goes on to give this advice. And he says, what I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. Wow, isn't that interesting? The time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. Now let's try and track Paul's thought here. He's given this advice on being single or married, and it's okay either way. It's not a command. It's fine wherever you find yourself in that scenario. But here he's talking about the temporary situation in life, and not to get consumed with these things. And he's using what we call overstatement here. In other words, when you look at the first one, you should, for those who have wives, should live as if they had none. Well, he's not turning around and saying, well, ignore your wife, and if you have a wife, just pretend you don't. That's not what he's saying clearly. He's using what you call overstatement, exaggeration, to make a point. And his point is, wherever you find yourself in, remember it's a temporal situation. It's not forever, okay? When he starts off at saying the time is short. And really he's saying, look, the Lord's coming back. This life is not going to be as it is now. And at the very end he says, for this world in its present form is passing away. And there's a sense that we need to keep that perspective wherever you find yourself this morning, be it single, be it married. You need to get that perspective in life. We can very easily get distracted in life, and things can become, as we say, all-consuming, and really forget what our calling in life is and what our mission is in life. And it's as if Paul is saying, if you're single, don't be distracted by your singleness. If you're married, don't be distracted by your marriage. People can use things, really. It's like the family. The family becomes a means to an end. Well, it's not, in the sense that, family becomes an end. But really, family is a means to an end. And we sort of can make idols of these things that really distract us away from our mission in life, in following God and serving God. And trusting him and realizing wherever we find ourselves. And he just doesn't say that about wives. He goes on to talk about, whether you're very, very happy or whether you're very, very sad. And of course, that's the experience in life, isn't it? But don't get wrapped up in the moment. That's what Paul is saying. Don't get caught up in the immediate. Make sure you have that perspective. Sometimes life will be very difficult. Sometimes life will be brilliant. That doesn't matter either way, but don't get distracted from your mission and the mission that God has called you to and the passion of following Jesus. And as our statement says, that the great command and the great commission would be a reality in the lifestyle of believers. Folks, that's what we're called. We're not just a club here. We've a passion to love God and love his people, and we've a passion to reach out to those who don't know Jesus. And that's the vision. That's the vision of the Bible. That's the vision we have here in Grace. And we need to keep that at the fore. We need to always remember that. And remember that the situations we find ourselves in are not always going to be there. They're temporary. And don't get obsessed with it, because sometimes we can. Whether it's being over anxious at being single or wondering or not sure, it can very, very easily happen. And Paul is calling us to a perspective. He's using overstatement to get the point across. Keep your eye on God's calling on your life. Don't get sidetracked with these things. And then he goes on. He goes on then in verses 32 to 35. He says, I would like you to be free from concern. So do you see, he's obviously interested that there is concern here. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs. How can he please the Lord? But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. So, do you see the advantage here that Paul is calling when he's talking about being single? For the very fact here he's saying, the one very good reason and very good advantage of being single is that you have an undivided attention in your devotion to the Lord, in your focus on the Lord. It's a very practical thing, isn't it? That single people are freed up from those of us that are married, that have other concerns. Of course, we're focused on the Lord as well, but we have families as well. We wives and vice versa. And in a sense, he's saying that being single has that advantage. That there's a singleness of thought, of devotion, of focus on the Lord. And isn't that very encouraging? I think you need to recognize singles out there that you are the special forces in God's army. Okay? You singles out there are the special forces in God's army. Because in a sense, God has given you, and you're enabled at this particular season. I'm not saying you're always going to be there. You might be, you mightn't be. That's not the issue. But if you're there now, and that's what you focus on, not what it might be, not what it could be, what it is, that you have a tremendous opportunity to focus and give your life in that sense without those other distractions that come. You're freed up to serve him and make the most out of that. Take that opportunity that you have now. If that's the season you're in life, great, grab it and go for it. Because it mightn't always be like that. And of course, again, it comes back to what we need to be focusing on. It's so easy to become discontented and get sidetracked from the Lord, isn't it? Particularly in these areas that we're talking about, particularly in singleness. And have a sense of contentment with the Lord and with the particular time you are and the season you are in life in regards to serving him. So that's the advantage that Paul is clearly saying. That's one good reason to be remaining single at this point in time. And then he goes on to the final. He goes, an unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world and how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. In a sense, he's just reinforcing this, isn't he? He's putting it the other way round. And he's saying, look, this is a great ministry and opportunity for you now. And you can focus on him and look to him So really, it's the same as what he's been addressing to both husbands and wives and to those who are yet not married. And then finally, and on this last feu verses in 1 Corinthians 7, he says, if anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if she is getting along in years and he feels he ought to marry, he should do so as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So Paul is saying, either way, we just go back to that previous slide. Paul is saying, either way, it's not right or wrong. If a person feels they want to get married, and of course we talked last week, God has made us sexual beings. We have that sexual drive. We're made like that. And he's talking particularly about those maybe who find themselves in a single position, but who want to be married and who have a heart to marry. That's fine. Look to the Lord for that. Go in that direction. Pursue that. That's a good thing to do. Remember, I think he said in the last chapter, it's better to marry than to born with passion. And here he's talking about that natural affection, and I think he's talking clearly in the sexual area here. That if that's the way you're wired, if that's the way God is calling you into that, pursue that. Look for a person. And it's right to marry. He doesn't say it's right or it's wrong. Do you notice here? He's given tremendous freedom. He's given great options here. And I think the background to this is, you see, we talked last week about there was this heresy of asceticism, which really meant it was legalism. And they were saying, if you're in marriage, you shouldn't have sex. And we saw that last week. Clearly, that's wrong, and sex is a good gift from God in that context. But these were saying, well, you're more spiritual about what you don't do, and if you abstain from these things, you're more spiritual. Paul wasn't having anything to do with that. Remember, we said that that's the way the flesh often goes. It's either two ways. It's either legalism or license. And in chapter 6, it was license, do what you want. If you have an urge for sex, well, just like an appetite. If you're hungry, then eat. If you want sex, just have it. And that spontaneous kind of demand for indulgence. That's the license. And Paul was saying, wait a minute here. There's a lot of wreckage that comes with that. But the other side of the pendulum was they were going legalism. They were saying, oh, you don't touch this, or even in marriage, you're not to pursue sex, abstain from it. Paul was saying, wait a minute. So I think in light of the legalism, we have to see that in the background of this. Paul is just given some wise advice. It's not a command. It's not, no, you can't do that. You shouldn't do this. But rather, if that's the way you are wired, if that's the way God's calling you to do, pursue that. Yeah, go after that. Whether it's for marriage or if it's staying single, where you feel that that's the way God has wired you, and you're content with that. Great. That's fine. And he's just talking about the natural instinct that's inbuilt within us, that God has built within us for that desire. And again, he's given these options in the sense that he's not been legalistic. He says, whatever way you pursue, that's okay. Be it staying single or being getting married. But he's not down on marriage or he's not down on singleness. Get that this morning, okay? He's not down on either of them. He's exalting both of them, okay? And certainly exalting singleness clearly in this passage. And now he finishes the last instruction before we go into a little bit of application here. So then he who marries the virgin does right. He who does not marry does even better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But he must belong to the Lord. Now, isn't that interesting that when Paul is talking about here of a person who finds themselves in that situation where maybe their spouse has died or whatever, obviously they're free and free in that context to remarry. Now, when he says marry anyone, he quickly qualifies that. Make sure the person you marry is a Christian, is a follower of Jesus. It's interesting that he puts that in there, isn't he? He's restricting that in the sense because probably there is that temptation that when someone either loses a spouse for whatever reason, that they get so worked about wanting to be married again that they just want to marry everyone and anyone, first person that comes along, because they had been married, and the temptation is to just jump into a relationship regardless because of that void with the loss of the spouse. Paul is saying, well, yeah, you're free to do that. Make sure they're a follower of Jesus. Make sure they're a follower of Jesus. And then I love the way he finishes. He says, in my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is. And do you see that? He's going back now to talk about the singleness again. He's elevating it. And then he says, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. It's almost like Paul, he's a little bit sarcastic there. What he's really saying is, look, I'm passionate for the gospel, and this is my good judgment on these things. I think he's saying I have a right to speak on these things. Now, he knows he's under inspiration as he writes this. He probably doesn't know that. He's just writing as anyone else is. But he is clearly under the inspiration of God here. But he just gets that sense that he is given some good advice to the folks there in Corinth and in the different situations that they're finding themselves in. And as we move to application this morning, that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? We really do need to reflect on what Paul is saying here. Because this covers all of us here today, doesn't it? But it certainly addresses the singles there today and those that find themselves in that season as we speak this morning. You need to just recognize God's calling on your life. Be content with that. Be content with where you're at. And if you feel God is bringing you in a direction eventually there to marriage, pursue that. But for the moment, serve Him. Serve Him wholeheartedly. Don't go for the lie to say, oh, wait till I'm in this position and then I'll be able to, we looked at that last week. That's the lie, isn't it? You pursue the calling of God on your life where you are. And that's to serve Him. And when you're single, you're given great advantages in that area. And take those advantages. Use that. You might not always have that. And recognize that special time and calling of God in your life. It's a wonderful thing. And I think us that are married need to encourage the singles and those that find themselves in that position. Remember I told you earlier on, don't be going around asking them when they're going to get married, okay? That's a no-no. Don't do it, right? It's insensitive and probably unbiblical. You need to encourage them. We need to encourage them. They're a great asset. And as I said, they're the special forces in God's army and God's calling. And we need to just encourage them in that. And bring some singles into your life. And as a married couple, bring singles into your life. You learn a lot from them. They learn a lot from you. I often think of churches that all of a sudden put ministries and they all have these individual, wait a minute. I think we're a rounded family that have all, certainly in Grace here we've all shapes and sizes, all ages, all, you name it. And I think that's the sense of which, but it's not just about meeting here, it's about getting involved in people's lives. There's different ways to do that. The home groups are a great way to do that because Our home group is great because we've singles there and we've marrieds. And it's a great opportunity to encourage them there. So get involved in that. You know, keep your focus on the kingdom. This world is passing away, folks. Lift up your eyes. Get that perspective. It's not going to always be like this. We have a purpose. We have a passion. And we're coming to the Lord's table now. And as we move from the word in Corinthians to bringing us back to the reality of Jesus' love for us. And in all of what we've said in Corinthians, and even talking about the human sexuality and all of these things, what's all behind that is this here. It's that passionate relationship with Jesus. And even our sexual longings, what's behind them is our desire for intimacy with God. That He is the lover of our souls. He is the one we pursue. We find contentment in Him. And wherever you find yourself this morning, whatever situation, your contentment, if you're a follower of Jesus, is in Him. And you need to keep going back to that. Because that's what drives us. That's what gives us that sense of desire and contentment in Him. That He died for you. He rose again to have that relationship, that connectedness with you. And when you've turned and embraced that, and if you've never done that, you need to turn to Him. If you're here and you're looking for, as Phil reminded us, or those songs all about love, all about whatever, behind them is that longing to be connected. And that's to be connected with your Creator, the lover of your soul. Jesus, who came down. God didn't just talk about it, He did something about it. And He done everything to bring you to Himself. Took that issue of sin and shame on Himself so that you could have that longing of your soul met in Him. If you've never done that, do that. Turn to Jesus. Embrace that. That's what it's all about. And then if you do know Him, be content in that. And focus on Him, focus on the mission that God has called you to with great passion and purpose. Amen. Let's pray. Father, thank you for reminding us through the Apostle Paul the realities of where we are in life and where we find ourselves. We confess we're easily distracted, very easily distracted. And we thank you even for passages like this that bring us back to the reality of who we are, and more importantly, who you are. And that our calling when we are followers of Jesus is that devotion to you, that you are indeed the lover of our souls, and we are eternally connected to you. And we praise you for that. And Lord, you've called us. It's not just an end in itself that we're fine and we're great and everything is good and life is good. That's not what it's about. You've called us. It's a means to an end. Whether in our relationships, in marriage or singleness or family or possessions or in grief or in pain or in great joy, it's all about the fact that we need to keep our focus on it. And your calling in on it. It's a short life. It's a short time. We don't know how long we will. But we have today. And we need to put our energy into it. To be great lovers of God and people and passionate about the lost. Wanting to see them come to Jesus. Oh Lord, wake us up by your Spirit. Thank you for bringing us to the cross now, the bread, your broken body. Oh, Lord, the cup, your shed blood. You gave yourself. You gave yourself to us. Wow. If we're in any doubt, Lord, bring us back to that place again. As the song says, I'm in that place once again. So, Lord, just do a work as we partake with great joy the bread and the cup. and be reminded of that great love and your calling on our lives. The time is short. You'll be coming back someday. We'll see you face to face. In the meantime, keep us loving. Keep us wherever we find ourselves. In Jesus' name, amen.